Okay, team, do you think we're gonna ready to kick off here?
Yes. Hi, my name is Derek Gunderson, and I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Northwestern Center on Law, Business, and Economics and our Workforce Science project for another one of our People Analytics virtual career meetups. It's my pleasure now to introduce Director of the Workforce Science project, Deborah Weiss. Deborah?
Thanks, Derek. We're delighted to see you all here. And I'd like to welcome our moderator, Richard Rosnow, the Vice President of People Analytics Strategy for One Model. And he has been providing a tremendous service to the people analytics community with his listings of people analytics roles that are open now that I've just put in the chat. And fantastic, fantastic resource. And these webinars are another opportunity for him to dive deeper into how organizations are shaping the roles and responsibility of people analytics. We have a fabulous guest here today, and I'll hand it over to Richard and let him introduce and get going.
Thank you, Deborah. And I'll second that. Chad, thank you so much for joining us today. I've had the pleasure of knowing Chad for feels like a couple of years, at least through LinkedIn, and I catch up in person a couple times. Just absolutely brilliant mind in the space. Has built teams, has seen teams different places. And one of the things we're going to get into this a little bit, but Chad, I love that you've got a bit more of an analytics background too outside of the HR space. So excited to dig in deeper there, and then also to talk about the roles in your team today. But Chad, welcome to the show. Really, really excited to have you on the meetup today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
And thank you for pushing through. I know you've got a little bit of a cold, but we appreciate you coming through for us and still sharing your knowledge with everybody on the call. So why don't we actually kick off with that technical side of things too? I really appreciate that you've got a technical background. We've had some people on with a bit more consulting backgrounds, or maybe they were in HR before. Excited for the audience to hear about that, but could you really tell us a bit of your professional journey, and then how did you find people analytics?
Yeah, sure. This is going to be a bit of a mouthful. So my segue into people analytics is somewhat interesting. I originally started my career in IT and systems administration. So supporting the infrastructure and the tools for various research organizations. As I was working in that space, I went to school part-time, online as you do. I actually went to a community college prior to prior to going to a 4-year school. And I became interested in instructional systems and design. So education, learning, human capital, human development, that sort of space, and started pivoting my career into more instructional systems and education. Finished my undergrad, moved into a graduate program at NYU in instructional systems and started working in that space. So I became an instructional designer. I was working with faculty, with leaders to create educational learning content, which means that I was exposed to all of these different tools, right? All these different learning management systems. And I started thinking, well, hey, like there's these online programs, there's these online tools. Are we doing anything with the data that's coming out of it? So that got that got the itch in my brain, and I started thinking more. And turns out that there's a whole field in education called learning analytics that was doing research in this space. It's a very novel and contemporary space. And I got interested in that area and applied to another graduate program at Columbia and started working as a learning analytics researcher. So I worked in educational technology for several years, worked as a data scientist, worked, primarily in Python and R and building these advanced ML solutions to predict the likelihood of things like high school dropout or post-secondary enrollment while looking at educational data. That was right around when people analytics was really becoming popular. Right? Like everybody here knows that people analytics is a fairly new space. It's, a new way of thinking in the HR practice. There's a whole digital transformation that's occurring. And I started hearing more and more about people analytics. And it was just kind of a natural progression for me to go from education and learning into people analytics, simply because it's a lot of the same data. It's a lot of the same problems. It's just framed under a different context. So my background is pretty interdisciplinary, and I think that affords me better opportunities in the people analytics space because you're often working with a lot of different COEs, a lot of different people with different backgrounds, and having the technical acumen to understand not only, what that high level question is for the business or for a leader, but also be able to translate that into something actionable and understand what it takes to deliver and build that product or that solution, I think is really important. So that's really how I transition into people analytics, right? I went from education into people analytics. A lot of the same problems, except now I'm not modeling the likelihood of high school dropout. I'm modeling the likelihood of an employee attrition, right? And yeah, I would say that, my team, the work that I do is everything from, simple descriptive analysis and reporting that you find in people analytics, but we also do some fairly advanced things. We'll do machine learning, we'll do unstructured data modeling, we'll do text extraction, we'll do network analysis, and more recently, we're now exploring things like generative AI and how we can use that to improve our overall HR practice.
Yeah, Chad, I really love hearing about that because it didn't pop as much from your LinkedIn or just conversations we've had about your kind of like that education, that learning management systems, and kind of coming from that perspective. I'm always fascinated though with when people make that jump from like servicing kind of the education space to corporate, because I'm sure there's some things that you saw in the education space that corporate just hasn't even touched yet. And so I'd love to hear, like, is there something that was going on when you were thinking about like learning analytics and learning systems? Like, what was at the forefront there that you're still waiting for corporate to catch up on?
Um, that's a really big question. I think the focus changes significantly when you go from corporate to, when you go from like an ed tech or academic space into a more corporate or industry focused role. In education, the focus is, hey, like high school dropout's bad. Everybody knows that, right? There's no convincing that needs to be done. We need to improve graduation rates for some populations. So the buy-in and investment's already there. I think for the corporate role, at least for the last three companies I've worked for, they didn't have a people analytics practice before I joined. And having to go in with the mindset to convince the business to make that investment and then also realize the ROI and value is something that I think is still an area of opportunity or growth in a lot of industries, or at least a lot of industry focused roles, right? You still have to do some convincing in the people analytics space to say, hey, we should spend $200,000 on this license to collect this data because it's going to be valuable because we need to reduce employee attrition because attrition is expensive, right? There's still some convincing that has to be done. Whereas in the education space, the outcome or the outcome variable that you are modeling is an understood, it's already understood by the field. Right. So I think HR as a whole is transitioning in the right direction. There's a lot more data-driven HR practices. There's a lot of digital transformation that's occurring. But there's still a lot of convincing that you have to do. There's still a lot of skepticism around some of the value that people analytics can bring to a business, especially when you start doing more advanced things where it's not very explainable, and explainability is very important in people analytics. So I think that's probably the biggest area. I've yet to go to an organization where, the CEO is, just says, hey, I know people analytics is the greatest. We're going to invest in it. We're done. Right. Like there's still some buy-in that has to occur.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I thought I was teeing you up for like a technical response, and what I got was fantastic. So thank you for digging us in there. It's a lot of times in this space, I found we think of people analytics as like we need the most technical people to solve the technical problem, and it's still a people problem the whole way down. Like most of businesses, let's change management, understanding, working through the skepticism, working through the kind of where are we heading with the field. So I really appreciate that. And on the CEO front, I am seeing a couple more CHROs kind of taking that like this is something I need, just make it happen, which is just a nice thing about the field evolving and changing, but not as often as we'd like. But hey, let me push forward just a little bit. It'd be great to hear a little bit about your team. You mentioned your team with kind of things you guys are up to, but how did you structure your team at ZoomInfo? And if there's any like lessons learned you've had from other times you've built teams that you brought with you, it'd be great to hear about those too.
Sure. So I'm a big proponent of non-traditional paths into people analytics, and I'm also a huge fan of improving diversity of thought in any sort of COE. So the way that I structured my team and have in the past at other organizations is I try to understand what the existing capabilities are across my team in order to, service the people analytics roadmap, but also understand where the deficiencies are in order to establish like a true community of practice in people analytics, right? There are people on my team that have a background in reporting, have a background in Workday, and they're not very technical, or at least they weren't when they first joined my team. They weren't, the person you needed to write the SQL code for the ETL, but they wanted to learn it, and I think that's also important. And then I also have people on my team that are true data scientists with backgrounds in data science, and they may not have the business acumen or understand what the context of leveraging data in HR really means. They have the 80% of the technical skills, but they don't really understand the business problem, but now they do. So the way that I like to structure my team is I like to have a very wide range of skills across the board, because people analytics, it's everything from reporting to advanced analysis to predictive modeling to prescriptive to scenario modeling, right? And I like to be able to do a little bit of all of that, especially in the beginning, in order to show and realize the value of a people analytics function to a business. So that's how I've structured it, is, understand the gaps and understand the strengths of my team, and then try and hire in between to close those gaps so that we have a wealth of knowledge across the board and we have a true community of practice, so that, my direct reports, when they reach out to one of their peers, they can get guidance and we don't operate in a vacuum.
That's a great perspective, really looking at people analytics as a system, and how do you bring that systems thinking to that org design. Thinking about people analytics as a function that at ZoomInfo, it'd be great to hear, do you centralize more? Do you decentralize? Are you the experts? Do you enable folk? Just thinking a little bit about that, like how do you play the role of the center of excellence in comparison to kind of actually enabling the function as a whole?
I think we do a little bit of both. It just depends on who we're working with and what the problem of the
Sure.
day is, right? So in the past at other organizations, I prefer to operate on a hub and spoke model, where we have, we're the hub or COE, and we have people on the team that are in various spokes of the business. So maybe I have one person, people analytics, is partnered with talent acquisition, one person is partnered with talent management, another person is partnered with comp and benefits, right? ZoomInfo, we're a little bit more agile, where everybody on my team is working across the board, and we are doing both enabling other functions through self-service by creating products and systems where other functions can actually extract their own stories and their own insights and create their own strategies, in addition to providing like bespoke and one-off analysis to the business, depending on, what the question is. I think it really depends. And I think a successful people analytics practice needs to do both, simply because it's a journey, right? It's not just, hey, here's some data, here's some insights. You have to assist with transforming the function of HR, and bring them along that journey and train them on how to read data, how to look at data, how to use that data to inform an insight. And part of that's just through old-fashioned partnership.
That's really helpful. And I like hearing the contrast between the different models, kind of it depends for each company. And I think that's something we hear a lot of people say, well, what's the benchmark? How should I do it? And it's like, no, you need to do it based on what your company needs. Maybe just to dig a step further, if you were in a hub and spoke model, but like, what are some of the problems you might expect that you need to move to that more agile model? Or like, what did you see at ZoomInfo that said, hey, I need to be a little more agile here. I don't need the hub and spoke as much. We're going to try something slightly different.
I think it's the maturity of the organization, right? Like past organizations I've worked, at IBM, I've worked at Stanley Black & Decker, I've worked at Reckitt Benckiser, I've worked at, a lot of these old legacy institutions. IBM's a bit of an outlier because IBM kind of invented the field, but, a company like Stanley Black & Decker has been around for 180 years. And the practice itself is traditionally, or has been traditionally, very heuristic. There's a lot of I guess the org is very large, so having a hub and spoke approach is a lot more meaningful, because like that spoke is interacting with dozens of people in that space. Whereas ZoomInfo, we're a tech company. A lot of the people already in HR are very data driven. Our CHRO, he's an economist by background. When I was interviewing with him, he was showing me his R code For the machine learning models he was building on some of the employee data. So with that level of expertise, there's a little less guidance that needs to happen in those other COEs, and there's a little less requirement for a hub and spoke approach. Whereas everybody in the business knows that people analytics exists, they can reach out and we can partner them. We can take that hub and spoke approach, but a lot of the leaders that I work with are already very, very data driven, and they just, they want to advance the org and the function in any way they can. And sometimes, I think a more agile approach works, especially since ZoomInfo. I mean, we're not 70,000 employees like SBD was, right? We don't have 350,000 employees like IBM. It's a little bit more tangible and easier to get things done that in a more agile approach than some of those other legacy institutions.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, if your CHRO has R open, you probably don't need spokes.
Right, and it also tells you that the leadership really values a data-driven approach.
It's cool to see.
So
it's cool to hear. So one of the exciting things we talked about in New York when we caught up was your team is growing. You've had some investment. You've been able to hire a couple more roles. Could you talk about why this investment came together? And then would love to hear about the open roles on the team.
Sure. Yeah, my team is growing. I think the investment came together because, I mean, we do show true value to the business, and it is realized all the way up to the top. The roles on the team are quite broad. Like I said, there's always kind of a trade-off you have to make when you're hiring in the people analytics space, right? You can hire on the technical side, you can hire on the HR business acumen side. There's just so many different projects, and the work is so diverse that I can see value from any background, in a people analytics role. These roles specifically on my team are related to data science work and business intelligence work. So we are now at the phase of our maturity model where we're becoming more advanced in our people analytics practice. We're less on the reporting, we're less on the, extracting reports from Workday and, creating pivots and insights in Excel. And we're at a point in our org where we are building some true products and systems, and that's where these roles are going to come into play. The data science role, I'm looking for somebody with a Python background. Like, I'm looking for somebody with a machine learning background who understands how to build a model, who understands how to validate a model, and then also understands how to put that model into a system of production so it's exposed in an analytics layer. Somebody who understands what Databricks is, how to use Databricks, who could collaboratively code using GitHub. I'm not necessarily looking for somebody with an HR background, though that is a nice to have at this point, but having somebody with a data science background in that role is exceptionally important. The BI analyst is primarily focused on building those analytics products and tools. So that means understanding how to use SQL to create data and tables in our Snowflake environment. And then ultimately working with the business to create the user experience, the story, the narrative in the dashboards. We're a Tableau shop, so understanding SQL is important because Tableau relies heavily on that language. And both of those roles together, I think, are going to set us up for success, at least in the next 2 to 3 quarters of our roadmap.
That's really helpful. And is there something about ZoomInfo you could share that would really help someone get to success? Like, is there something in the culture or something about the company, like, hey, someone who has this kind of background or that kind of background? And I know I'm kind of like dangerously leading you towards like a culture fit kind of questionnaire, but just thinking about like, what is it that makes someone successful at ZoomInfo would be a helpful thing to just spend an extra minute on.
Yeah, I think ZoomInfo, we're all about winning, right? We're all about running fast and winning. And sometimes, if you can get to 90% in 3 days versus 100% in 3 months, then we'll take the 90% and we'll, make a decision on that and then move forward. We like to run fast, and we like to trip fast and pivot and adjust and move on. So if there's anything about ZoomInfo that I would say is that our business is, we're very agile, we're very successful in our market. And and yeah, I think grit plays a lot into it. And I think understanding that sometimes you fail, but it is okay to fail, because that in itself is an insight and it gives you more information on what you can do better next time. And that's perfectly fine here, right? Where as long as we get to that win. The other part is probably the incremental value piece. As anybody who's worked in people analytics knows, that nobody in the business is going to wait 6 months to get a dashboard out, right? You have to provide value immediately. So at least the way my team is structured is we have these long-term projects or epics established in our roadmap that we dedicate around 50 to 60% of our capacity to across the team. That other 40% are for the things like when the CHRO messages you, on a Saturday morning with a thought and they need an answer. And we need to recognize that those questions and those issues are going to persist always, and we need to account for that. So having the ability and having the agility to like bounce back and forth between long-term project thinking and then also immediate incremental value is important to the success of this role.
That's super helpful. And you mentioned kind of not necessarily having an HR background, which is interesting, great, and super helpful. Kind of the next question I had for you though was, as someone who joined HR a little bit later in career, what are some surprises you had journeying into the function? That could either be delightful surprises or disappointing surprises, whatever it might be. And doesn't have to be at Zoom Info, but just would like to hear about that, sort of like what was it like to come into HR when you did?
I think what was really interesting to me is that there are, like, from my perspective, it's interesting to see who are the movers and who are the shakers in the HR business, right? And the one thing I would say is, in the people analytics space, it's very important to have relationships that are outside of your direct org. Network, understand what the problems that other functions are facing every day, and how they're tackling them, and whether or not analytics can provide value. What was really surprising to me is that there are a lot of data-driven functions in HR, and there's a lot of analytics that occurs in HR, but they may not know they're doing it. That's what's interesting. Is that I've definitely walked into a room at a previous company and I had conversations with a learning management team, and they're like, yeah, no, like we have reporting on all of this, and I'm like, but this isn't a report. This is a dashboard. Like this is updating daily. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, you guys are doing this is learning analytics. This is people analytics. You're doing it. You just don't know you're doing it. And I think that was pretty eye-opening. Oftentimes HR is perceived as this like support function that operates in the background of a business. And it's really not. Like HR is, it's like the mortar that holds a company together. And the data shows that. So I think that was probably most eye-opening. It's kind of like
That's helpful.
So I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I love all my friends that are employee relations. It's a spectacular center of excellence, but they definitely get like the brand of HR is definitely on it, like hinges on that function. And then you go talk to your comp team that's been doing data for a very long time. So it's funny to see, and I agree with you on that. And it's would love to hear your thoughts on this too. There's also, I think some people think people analytics is another vertical. So if we think about like comp and recruiting and talent and learning, those are verticals within the HR space. But it really is more of a horizontal. We support kind of across, just like in HR ops or in HR tech. Would love to just hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization and how it's designed. I mean, we can talk for days on, organizational topology, span of control, spans of layers, and what the optimal design is for a business. But I've actually sat in both verticals. I've sat in an HR practice where I rolled up to a CHRO, and then I've also been at a company in people analytics, but I reported up to the chief AI officer in a tech function. And we supported the HR practice, but we didn't roll up to it. And there are pros and cons to both approaches. I definitely think that, I don't think that people analytics is its own vertical. I do think it's lateral support across each function. But I also think it varies depending on the business and the size of the organization. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a, chief people analytics officer job title at any major organization. I think, it's up to CHRO or the executive space. You may roll into like organizational effectiveness. Sometimes, often, comp and benefits will own people analytics. But no, it's very cross-functional, and I think that's how it should be viewed and perceived, because at the end of the day, the success of people analytics is also really about the data and having access to that data. So those are some of the biggest challenges that I faced, in my career. Is I know the data exists, but how do I get access to it? And when you think about employee life cycles and the employee journey as a whole, when you start looking at your ATS data, your HRIS systems, your performance data, your employee experience data and surveys, you can really start to paint a great picture on what the workforce looks like across the entire organization. And you don't get access to all of that unless you work cross-functionally across all of those verticals.
Super helpful. Thanks for diving into that with me too. So maybe pulling us back up a little bit, it'd be great to hear a little bit of some like success stories, or if you have moments you've been really proud of the Zoom Info team, feel free to give people some shout outs too, but just a moment for you to kind of shine a light on like what are some of the great things your team's accomplished, if people are interested in joining the team, or if they know someone who might be interested in joining the team.
There's a lot of things that we've accomplished that I can speak to. I mean, we launched simple dashboards on headcount and attrition metrics that were oftentimes very difficult for the business to get, without running a manual analysis, dedicating a lot of time. So just being able to save, the HR function, tens of hours per week or thousands of hours per year in itself, I think is really valuable. The more recent, I think, win that is worth highlighting is our use of generative AI. One thing that we found in, not just at Zoom Info, but this is something that persists, I'm sure, at a lot of organizations, is just the quality of how people write their goals. Whether or not they're measurable, whether or not they're aligned to corporate objectives, whether or not they're, simplified enough to obtain. And we stood up a tool. We worked with some other stakeholders in the business to create a web application that was integrated into Workday, and you could click a button when you were writing your goals for the second half, and it would pass through our language learning model, and it would provide feedback on whether or not it was measurable, whether or not it was aligned to the corporate objectives.
That's very cool.
Of their function. And what we're seeing, and this is something that we're digging into now, hopefully paper to come out soon, TBD, is the quality of the goals have increased. The length of the goals have increased. There's a lot more detail, and we turned that around in like 3 weeks, right? So being able to like build a whole platform and system, integrate it, launch it, get the company onboarded to it, I think was a huge win by the team. And I thought, that's probably one of the cooler projects we've done. You're looking at contemporary, AI systems. It's so that was pretty fun. And now there's a lot more talk on where we can leverage Gen AI across all of HR as a product of that initial work.
That's fantastic. That's a fascinating example, and kind of brings up a couple other questions too. Just thinking about Gen AI within HR, does that fall within your remit within people analytics, or is it sort of like a shared remit across teams? It'd be great to hear about kind of how that falls, because I've seen some people analytics teams be forced to pick it up because they're like, hey, this is data related and you're a bunch of data people, you guys take it. Whereas sometimes it's HR ops kind of takes the lead, because a lot of the Gen AI approach is really solving some things that are more HR ops in nature. So just love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Oftentimes the business reaches out to me or my team because we're central and we kind of know what's going on across the business. Gen AI the Gen AI systems and tools are owned by our data science function. But my team basically operates as like project manager for implementing those models in a way, like engineering the prompts and working with the stakeholders to understand whether or not the feedback is valuable, assessing for bias, right? There's a huge like ethical implication for leveraging any sort of AI system, whether it's an LLM or a machine learning model, right? But I don't know if anybody owns it. But we often champion it, if that makes sense.
And that might be right. I mean, it's like who within the organization owns Excel?
Right.
Everybody. Well, maybe IT owns Excel, but but just thinking about those kind of like those pervasive tools, and AI as a toolkit is not something that one team will do, but it's going to impact everybody. But that's super interesting to hear about. I'll just a quick time check. I've got a couple more questions for you, but then we'll definitely open it up to Q&A at the 45. So if people are thinking about questions, if there's things that have popped up so far, throw them in the Q&A chat or in the webinar chat, and I'll start collecting those while we're chatting here. So one of the things that's come up a couple times on these calls is people are wondering, like, what are some skills and competencies that are crucial for success in people analytics? And just skills are very much so a hot topic right now, kind of across the board. But generally, what are some things if somebody wanted to evolve their career or break into this space? What are some things you would suggest to focus on if they really wanted to go after people analytics as a space?
I don't know if it's a popular opinion, but I think empathy is a really important soft skill to have in people analytics.
Love that.
Being able to understand and recognize the perspective of the person that, of your stakeholder, and really, take that into design, I think is important to have either way. From a more like tangible, list of items, I think technical skills are important, but it depends on the maturity of the organization and the size of the business and, the other functions that exist in people analytics. If you're a one person shop, right, a lot of small to mid-sized companies just have one person doing people analytics and they own all of it, right? I think breadth is better than depth. So understanding like how and when to use Python, but maybe not being an expert in it, or understanding like how to use SQL, but maybe not being an expert in it because you're going to delegate those tasks to people like data engineers or data scientists or whatever, I think is important. But really, again, it really depends. Having business acumen, having HR experience can be important, if that's lacking on a people analytics team. I've had people in my people analytics org who have come from places like talent acquisition or an HR generalist, and they reached out to me and said, hey, like, I really want to learn more about data. I really want to pick up those skills. Can I join people analytics? Can I come in and can you train me? And more often than not, that's really been successful for them. And it's really been valuable to me because they're coming in with the perspective and context that is oftentimes lost if your team is highly technical as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I think skills, I mean, like, you can do a lot with Excel too. So I don't want to scare people away and say, oh, you have to learn programming, you have to learn coding. Like you pick it up, and oftentimes like you do pick it up as the people analytics function matures. But you can do a hell of a lot with Excel. You can do a hell of a lot with, Tableau or Power BI or whatever's out of box. So I think grit, agility, a lot of those soft skills, empathy, I think those are much more valuable to success of people analytics, because I feel like we're oftentimes pivoting and we're learning new things. We're getting brought onto new projects that we had no exposure to a week ago, but now, we need to be experts on in, 2 weeks from now. Because made a decision. So
I really like that you led with empathy too, because I think that's something with people analytics in particular, like regular analytics or marketing analytics or finance analytics. You still need some empathy to know what the customer is up to. But with people analytics, like, our data is humans, and our data is people with livelihoods and friends and families, and work impacts all of those things. And the data and the decisions we make really require that depth of empathy that you would hope everybody has. But just for this space in particular, I think that is a leading like kind of soft skill around that. So yeah, we really appreciate that you led there.
Yeah, and
maybe push. Oh yeah, please.
I was to say, and I'll say with my background coming from educational technology, there's always this lingering question in the back of my head of anything around people or human data. Is there an adverse impact? Are we going to be equitable in how we apply this system? Is there biases that exist in some sort of model or output? And I think having that perspective and the ability to understand, recognize it, and call it out is important to the success of people analytics. So if anything, like, that's a good skill. So sometimes I'm the Debbie Downer on the call, that on the call with the vendor that gets brought in as the data expert in HR, and I'll start asking questions like, oh, this is a really cool assessment. Have you done an adverse impact study? Do we know we're not disproportionately applying assessing different populations? So it's a double-edged sword, but I think it's a good perspective to have, because at the end of the day, right, we want to be net positive to the employees, to the business, and having that perspective is important.
That's great. Maybe taking it to a little bit more later stage in career, we've had a couple questions from people on the previous calls about moving into management roles and what that's like going from like kind of an IC independent kind of data science or data analyst into like leading a team. And what skills do you need to make that happen, or what skills do you need to leave behind? And just talking about that transition into management would be really helpful.
Yeah, that's also, I think, going to be dependent on the organization and how it's
Sure.
structured. So at previous companies, as a director, as a leader, as a manager, I would go months without looking at programming code because I was managing the team, I was managing the solutions and the systems. ZoomInfo were a little bit different. I would consider myself an IC manager, where I'm also like rolling up my sleeves, deep in the data with my direct reports. And I actually find that to be a little bit more advantageous because your skills don't atrophy. I don't think I have to leave something behind, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
The management piece, I think like the single greatest skill you can have as a manager in people analytics, or if you're making that transition from an IC to to a manager in people analytics, it's really basic project management skills, right? Like being able to define to the business and level expectations on on what's being requested. There's one thing I live by, if someone on my team does something wrong, then it's my fault. If they do something right, then it's their win. Right. And you kind of have to go into management with that perspective, because oftentimes, you'll find yourself in a position where something didn't go as great as you wanted it to. And I view myself as a shield for my direct reports. But I also rely on their expertise and their knowledge. I hired experts and I want my direct reports to be smarter than me, right? Because I rely on them and I value their perspective. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It answers my question and then some, especially with the open roles. I think that's a really helpful answer to give for people that are considering looking at the team, thinking about joining. Yeah, you're showcasing what you get up to at ZoomInfo very well. So thank you for digging in there. I've got one more question for you, and then we'll jump to Q&A. And we've got two lined up in Q&A, but please keep them coming there, because Chad is very, very nicely open book for us here today, asking different things. A little bit of a different path here, but we've been hearing a lot about like non-HR data or non-HR tech system data, and different people analytics teams starting to bring in those more unique data sets. Could you talk about, is that something you're pursuing at ZoomInfo, or is it something you would like to pursue in the future? And kind of like, what data sets are you thinking about that are maybe not traditional HR tech data sets?
Yeah, sure. And I think you already know the answer to this. I'll say there's, at least more recently, there's this big question on like operational efficiency, performance, productivity, employee experience. And, traditionally you would leverage something like a survey, something written in Qualtrics in order to assess, burnout or understand how we can improve the employee experience overall. But more recently, there are several tools, that we're looking at leveraging in order to get a more holistic picture of like, what does a workday look like for an employee, or what does burnout look like, or what's the best way to communicate between remote and RTO populations, given that we do have a return to office mandate for some of our employees, and some employees are remote. And we're a global company. Teams are dispersed across different time zones. So you naturally have to look at different like different systems, right? Whether it's, calendar information on who's meeting with who to understand and optimize networks and, push teams together who are frequently communicating and meeting, but maybe in different time zones. My team has also looked at things like Salesforce data, right? We oftentimes get pulled into understanding like sales performance, and then also layering that in with things like HR, HR strategies. Like if a manager goes through a manager training program, does that naturally impact the performance of the people they're managing from a sales perspective? Like these are all questions that are starting to fall into the people analytics space that have historically or intrinsically not been readily available. And I think that speaks to the shift of the overall like people analytics practice as a whole. I think businesses are starting to realize like, it's not just about HR data, it's about humans in general. And we have a lot of data on on employees, on people outside of what the HR systems are collecting.
That's super helpful. Thanks, Chad. So we've got a couple questions in the Q&A here, so I'll read them off to you. The first one's from Christian Straight. She said, can you share examples of DEI analytics? And I'll preface that while you're thinking about some examples of DEI analytics with just an answer to Christian. This is a tough one to share. And it's something that I've seen really spectacular DEI analytics out there from a lot of different teams, but a lot of times it's under attorney-client privilege. And so that means that the company is investigating something because they want to do the right thing. They know they can do the right thing, but they don't want to find something that then gets them in trouble, or they have to act on different ways. It's a complicated space, especially in the US when it comes to litigation around this. So it's a tough one to look for examples. But now that I've vamped for a little bit to give Chad some time to think of some examples, Chad, do you have anything you'd like to share around DEI?
Yeah, and I'm going to keep it super generic and vague. I will say this is for a past organization, but one of the biggest wins that we found for the DEI space in general is that, several years ago, company I was working for set out a goal and said, look, like we want to achieve, parity in our underrepresented groups in our management population, right? Like a lot of companies will have a goal and say, look, like we want like 50-50, like, women and male VP leader population or whatever. And oftentimes they'll set that goal, but they won't really understand what it means or what it takes to get there. So some of the work that my team has done in the past is really understand, if we have a global organizational wide goal that we want to improve our underrepresented population in management positions, how do we really get there? Like, how do we promote? How do we identify that talent? What do we have to do if we see elevated voluntary attrition in those populations? Is that because, the culture's bad? Is that because there's no affinity group? Like whatever. And one of the things that we put together is actually a scenario model platform where leaders could go in and look and see, like if I want to reach X percentage by X year, over the next like 10 years, maybe, like this is how we need to really start thinking about our talent mobility. This is how we really need to start thinking about what that attrition really does to the business and what it takes to close that gap. Really vague, and I'm gonna leave it there. But there's a lot of opportunity in DEI, and that's an active space of people analytics. I'd be surprised. Something simple, pay equity, right? That oftentimes falls in people analytics. Like that's also an area where DEI is important. But
Yeah, there's a lot of great work happening. It's hard to talk about, but there's I'll throw a reference in the chat too. There's a book. It's Victoria Mattingly. She's a local Pittsburgher for me here. She wrote a book called Inclusalytics. Inclusalytics is a great reference for anyone interested in DI analytics, wants to go a little bit deeper. There's great case studies in there, things going on. And usually offline, you can ask someone some questions to them. They'll give you more follow-up, but maybe not on the recording. Okay, so let me push forward a little bit. We got a technical question from Oleg. He says, Chad, are you doing benefits preference studies? Thinking about max diff.
Again, I'm going to keep it generic because I don't want to speak for Zoom info. But yes, I have done benefits preference studies around. There's actually been some interesting insights that came up. There's a lot of there's a different perceived value in benefits that I have found based on like generations of employees, which naturally you would see that. But yes, it is something that I've done in the past. Is there an appetite for it? Like currently, it's really seasonal, right? When you think about like benefits and when you think about like how an organization operates, like sometimes you're locked into a contract for X number of years, so it may not come up, right?
That's helpful. And we had two questions from Ramya. Ramya, thank you for putting the questions in. She said, the first one was, what career trajectory would you recommend for someone transitioning from a BI role to a data science role in HR? If somebody wanted to up level, or up level is the wrong word there, because those are more different disciplines. And I'm going to correct myself on that because we tend to think of them as up leveling, and the reality is it's very different roles that serve different purposes with a lot of value in both. But without confusing it further, if somebody wanted to transition from BI to data science, what are some things you'd recommend to them?
Well, I actually think it's a very common pathway, as you'll often see like an analyst turn into a BI role, turn into a data science role. I think like if you look at the skills Venn diagram, there's a huge overlap. In terms of transitioning, like the best advice I can give is I think it can be tough to just go from a BI role at one company to a data science role at another, unless you're going to be unless you have a relationship with them and they're willing to train you. Oftentimes the best way that I've seen that play out is you get a role as a BI engineer or a traditional BI role, and then you pick up the data science skills and you start showcasing your ability to apply those skills in a business function, and you kind of transition your BI role into a data science function naturally. That's probably not the best advice though. I don't know, but that's how I've seen it be most successful, because again, like the Venn diagram is very broad, like the BI analyst role on my team. I would love for somebody who applied who is hungry to learn about data science, right? Because I want to provide those opportunities and I want to, potentially shift that role into a data science position moving forward. But it's really about like getting the function you are qualified for and you have the acumen for, and then still being hungry enough to learn those new skills. I'm a huge proponent of communities of practice. I'm a huge proponent of just like expand your network, meet new people, whether it's at your company that's doing the work that you want to do, or it's outside, going to meetups, going to those types of events. My doctorate's in cognitive science. So I'm a huge fan of like situated cognition, right? It's when you like situate yourself in the environment and you learn by doing. That's kind of like how I how I've built my career. A lot of trial by fire. So don't be afraid to be outside your comfort zone. That's a big one. Put yourself in positions where you may not be the most comfortable doing it, but once you force yourself to learn it and get it done, you'll look back and realize like, wow, I can't believe I learned that much and now I know this new skill. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's incredibly helpful, and it's we should have known, asking a question about how to learn to Chad, you will get a great answer back. So thank you for that, Chad. The second question from Ramya, I'm going to lean in more to the second half of the question there. She said she was talking about generative AI, and then given the limited explainability of the generative AI models, how effective do you think they will be when it comes to HR analytics?
That's actually a great question, because I think explainability is very important when it comes to human data or data analysis. I think language learning models there are some platforms out there where you can get some explainability out of it, but ultimately they're built on millions and billions of rows of text data, and it is a black box solution. I think the value of HR analytics is going to be based on the use case. I don't think Gen AI is going to be the end all be all for anything. Like I wouldn't ask a generative AI system to write, an employee performance review, right? Because that's not like Gen AI is not going to know. It's going to give you the generics. And I personally have experienced like plenty of hallucinations. Like it takes a lot of prompt engineering to get exactly what you want out of it. And I think being diligent and critical on what it's providing is important for the success of people analytics. Analytics side, not so much. I think more on the optimization side, I think, is where it provides more value. Like I said, the goal setting is one of those like low hanging fruit where the risk is very low. We're not detrimentally impacting, employees, and we had a lot of control over what the output of that model was giving based on what the input is, right? Like the guardrails are very constrained. When you start generalizing it, I think it's a good springboard, but I think it's TBD, and the fact that it's not explainable leads to a lot of challenges. Oftentimes there'll be a model that performs better, but it'll be harder to explain. And therefore, like you're better off using something that's explainable, especially in an HR practice where there's usually heavy skepticism. There's a lot of, training you have to do to bring somebody on that journey. Again, my background is ed tech, machine learning. Like I've worked with educators, with teachers, with K-12, school teachers. And for someone like me to walk in and say, I know more, I know with a higher degree of accuracy what fifth grader is going to drop out of high school, and I've never met them before. Like you say that to a fifth grade teacher, like there's going to be a lot of skepticism with that claim. But being able to back that up and show how the model came to its determination is really important to generate that value and to generate that trust in AI. And you run into the same issues in people analytics. So I think explainability is a gap that needs to be closed. But if you put enough guardrails up, I think there's definitely still lots of value that can be found. It just depends on the use case and what the context is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like what the example you gave too, that it was providing feedback. It wasn't generating the report. And that's almost a safer spot to be when it comes to those hallucinations, because I can take in the feedback, like, it doesn't make any sense. I'm going to ignore that piece. But the parts that did make sense there. We've got a couple more questions in here. So we have a great question from Arcana. I'm sorry, I'm saying your name wrong there. She's working through kind of balancing showcasing technical skills and balancing showcasing project management skills. In a people analytics interview, how would you work through that balance of needing to be technical, but also needing to be project management, also needing to have that HR experience? It's a bit of a funny thing in people analytics that we've got this very diverse field, which can be a bit tough to juggle. And could you reflect on that and maybe provide some feedback on how to navigate an interview experience?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the audience. One of the things that I found successful is being able to translate a highly technical solution to a non-technical audience. So if your resume can express that, if you can express that in the interview, I think it's going to lead you down a much more fruitful path than just showcasing one or the other. I oftentimes, whenever I'm interviewing or in the process of interviewing, you have to pick your audience, right? Like if you're meeting with an executive or a leader, like stay out of the weeds, and recognizing when to stay out of the weeds versus recognizing when to dive in is important. It's very rare that I'll have an executive ask me what algorithm I use to create this model. What they really care about is, what is this? What does it mean to me? And how do I use it to inform the business or inform my strategy? And being able to jump back and forth between both of those worlds to say, to speak to answer those questions that the leader has, but also be able to dive technically in that interview, I think is important. But, read the room, like ask questions first as a first part of that process, because, their title may say they're, director of people analytics or director of operational, of operations or experience or whatever, or they're director of systems, right? And like you would naturally think like, oh, that's a technical person, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a chief of staff that made their way into that role and they're doing a good job of it, but they're looking for somebody else to be a leader in that space, and you have to speak to the general value that you can bring. So I don't know. Not really great advice, but read the room, know who you're talking to, ask a few clarifying questions early on, and then know when to see the forest from the trees and vice versa. Because you need to have both skills to be successful in this space. Like you need to be able to turn it on and turn it off depending on who you're talking to and what the audience is. There's nothing that makes an HR generalist's eyes glaze over when you start talking about like standard deviations and, log transformations on a distribution, right? So.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I'm even seeing some empathy in the chat here too. That I think if there's a takeaway for anybody on the call here, it's that balance is work, and it takes work to get there. And everyone in people analytics is working through that to some degree. I'm going to go through a couple rapid fire here just to kind of talk through them. Osama says, does building a test project make a difference? So when you're interviewing a candidate, if they have a test project or something on their website from People Analytics, would that impact your thoughts around them or on the career likelihood of that person joining the team?
Yeah, I think it depends on the role and the level. Like if I was looking for like an early professional hire, somebody that's within 0 and 3 years of graduating, from a university, or maybe they didn't graduate, maybe they just pivoted their career. Again, huge proponent of non-traditional pathways. I think Yes, it can be valuable. I can say right now that the way that I do interviews is I have like data challenges, and sometimes I will look at your project in lieu of giving you a data challenge. Depends on what the project is, but I think showing like proactive work is important. Showing that you're still like dedicated to the space, even though you may be looking for your next opportunity, I think can be valuable. But pick and choose what you illustrate, right? If it's something simple, if it's been done 1,000 times on Kaggle, like maybe not. But if it's something novel, then yeah, if it would definitely pique my interest. I'd jump into it. I'd be like, oh, this is really cool. Let me have a conversation with them. Um, but
Yeah, it's super helpful.
if you're doing it to like fluff up a resume, then I don't know about that. But if it's something fascinating, then yeah, jump into it. Yeah.
That's helpful. So unfortunately, we're not going to get to all the questions today, but we've got one we'd like to end on in the final minute here. If you had 60 seconds of advice you would pass on to people looking to join the people analytics space, what are some things you'd like to pass on?
Absolutely. So this is something this is advice I give to a lot of people all the time. So if you've met me in the past, you've probably heard it before. But the one thing that I would advise people to do who are looking to apply in this space is never select yourself out of the interview process. If you are looking for a job in people analytics, it's a very diverse and interdisciplinary field, right? And you can bring value, like a lot of knowledge transfers over. So if you look at a position or a job posting and you're looking at, the 10 bullets, you're like, oh, well, I can really only do like 4 of these on this list. I don't qualify. Hit apply. You never know, right? Like make them do the selection. Never select yourself out. Aim for the sky. And then the other piece is, constantly just keep learning, constantly learn, expand your network, read the publications, read what one model has coming out. Like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this space and it's constantly growing, and staying on top of it, I think would be really advantageous to anybody who wants to move into this world.
That's incredibly helpful. And what a good note to end on. Uh, everyone, please join me in a round of applause. Thank you for Chad. Chad, thank you for joining us today. And if you wanted to go back and see something that's going on, or you wanted to see some of our past meetups, we've actually got them on an archive page now. I've dropped that into the chat too. So you can kind of see what's going on. You can also see when the next one pops up, we'll have a registration link there. And again, Chad, thank you. I learned a lot today. Really appreciate checking in. You'll always see what's going on. And can't wait to hear more.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chad. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.